You unlock this benefit with the key of Patreon. Beyond is another dimension. A dimension of thought. A dimension of speculation. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both waffle and substance. Of things and ideas. You've just crossed into the podcast zone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Trekking Through the Twilight Zone. This is Julian and I working our way through season 2 of the classic Twilight Zone series, and this one's a bit of a howler. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be talking about the Howling Man, and this one, I need to check, is this who wrote this episode?
Is this Charles Beaumont. So this is the first one based on his story, The Howling Man. So this is the first episode of the second season that wasn't Serling.
Right. What were your thoughts on this?
I didn't like it at first, but by the end, I really quite like it. I think it really is like a horror story instead of a science fiction one. It has supernatural. I mean, it's got the devil. And by the end of it, I thought, this isn't great, but I can see the story continuing. It's kind of like the Sandman, with the opening of Neil Gaiman's Sandman, where, and later on in that series, you find out that like the reason why the 20th century was filled with so much destruction is that destruction, the literal god destruction, left, and so his reign is just chaotic, which isn't actually, doesn't make sense based on the statistics. But the idea that like somebody's got the devil imprisoned, and that's why there's these pauses between wars. Is quite fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. It made me think of sort of like it was, this idea of a walking holiday and coming across something, and this idea of sort of antiquated or things. It made me think of like M.R. James as well. This idea of there's one in particular, the I forget it's called now. There's one that this reminded me of that where they've got like a demon trapped in a church. And it was, but I liked it. Again, sort of like, I did chuckle at the depiction of the devil in this. Like, it's very, I don't know, it's so on the nose. But I like the transformation.
I mean, he seems like a normal guy until he escapes and then he morphs.
Yeah, no, the morph, the final morph, when he appears and he's got the goatee and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's very sort of like,
and a cape.
Yeah, it's like it's very cheesy, sort of like the devil. But the morph, the change is done very well. I really enjoyed that. The way they did it as he walks past the pillars, and by the time he gets past each of the pillars, like something changes. It's done very subtly. But the lead up to this, I have issues with some of the sort of the choices that are made. That's interesting. So this idea, this has also something. One of the cliches I absolutely hate in these things. So this guy, is it Edmonton?
Ellington.
Ellington, sorry. He is on a walking holiday in Europe, and during a storm, comes across this monastery. And when he gets in, they're like, "We can't look after you. Like, we can't take care of you. You're going to have to leave." And then he passes out because he's been out in the rain for all of 10 minutes. And that's the thing I hate. This idea of people getting ill within 2 minutes or whatever of being in. I've been in the storm and then passing out. And again, this comes back to this stupid idea of the amount of people that just pass out or swoon at things. Like, we've all walked through a heavy rainstorm and got home and gone, "Well, I'm soaked and I'm fine." But this idea of sort of like that, they're coming down with illness it feels so weak. It just sort of bothers me. But
yeah, that is a cliche. I mean, I sort of, I don't know how long he's been wandering, but he does seem quite weak throughout the flashback portion of the episode. It's quite an extended. Like, I would think, like, what bothers me is like once you've slept, you're fine the next day, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But again, the thing is, and them trying to drive him away is the problem I have. Where it should be, I'm trying to literally keep the devil under wraps, so I have to have. There has to be a positive. There has to be a good to contain this bad. So that I think they should be taking him in, but then it should be this sort of like, almost like the Adam and Eve, like at the end of the story, like the Adam and Eve thing of like, right, you can stay and we will look after it, but you do not go down there. Like, that is off limits. Like, you do not go down there and ignore the Howling. If it was that, and then he sort of like, didn't heed that warning or didn't listen to that, and then went into that place and found the Howling Man, then that becomes, to me, becomes more interesting, because they're like, well, they're clearly good people because they're willing to help me, but they're also sort of keeping this person hidden from everyone. So
I think you're right. And that leads me to realize why I was sort of bored with the beginning and quite like the end. That the beginning doesn't have, oh, by the way, that is exactly what I tell guests at my house. You can stay here, don't worry about it, but ignore the howling and you can't go downstairs. It works some of the time. Other times you have to add them to the prison. But so, yeah, I mean, the beginning doesn't have that mystery horror thing, right? I mean, it's just, I'm in this castle. Here are these monks that all look like Moses. They're carrying this sort of staff and long beards. And you don't really get that sense of mystery of, what's going on. I mean, he hears the howl, but you don't get the that sort of spooky sense that you would in, like a Hammer horror film or something.
Yeah. And funny enough, I thought about Hammer. I was thinking, if they play this up a little more, if this was to lean into that sort of like the Hammer wouldn't probably come. Hammer becomes Hammer after 1960. But if you were to lean into that sort of like Hammer-esque ideal, this would be a lot more fun. Like, I could totally imagine like Cushing and Christopher Lee being the two in this, like Christopher Lee being the head monk, and then Peter Cushing being the one that's sort of like, lost in the wilderness.
As it is, there's no like hook, right? There's nothing that tells you here's why I should be interested.
Yes,
it's just some things going on.
Yeah, it just took a series of events, like, and fine, that's sort of how, real life happens. But really, if you're telling a story, like, you want that hook, you want that mystery of like, yes, you can stay, but you cannot go down there, and that's what I was hoping for. But you do get that thing of like he passes out, and then you get this. They build on the mystery, like when he is being looked after by that monk, and he goes into the room, and then he locks the door. He's like, "Why are you locking me? Why are you locking us in?" It's like, it's for your own protection. And I kind of like that. They're like, at night we have to lock our doors from the inside. Like, we are keeping the rest of the castle out. So I kind of like those little moments. But again, like it comes a little late to really sort of fully to be. It should be that moment when he goes to that sort of guy's room to be. There's always he'll look after you in his cell or whatever. That should be like an additional. That's like another thing where it's like, look, well, this was weird. Now this is weirder. Like, I'm now feeling uncomfortable. Like, now I'm having to debate whether is the storm better for me or not. Like, I don't know. And that would be the way this would lean. But yeah, then he obviously meets the guy in the through the prison door.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about all of that, and I think that part of the failure is the way those Moses dudes are depicted. Yeah. They should be weird and mysterious and creepy. And instead, they just seem odd. And even when David's being lectured about not letting that guy go, and he says, oh, he's the devil. David says, okay, I believe you. And it's clear he's lying because it's unrealistic. He'd be absolutely convinced, as he says, in 2 minutes. But it seems like they, like lock this guy in his room,
yeah,
or like make this guy really convinced, like, you cannot do this. This is a bad man. Even if you don't believe me about the devil, this is a bad human being. He's a liar. I mean, you could go further instead of just saying, oh, you believe me? Fine. Roam the castle grounds.
Yeah. High fives all around. No, and especially because there's a point in this where the sort of like the head monk, they call him all brother. He gives him an explanation. Like, he says, like, I've been here 5 years, and he says that this isn't my life. Like, I had this other life. I was I was this other person. I did well, and and now he says like these robes, this beard. He says, this wasn't me 5 years ago. That should be that there should be more. Like again, if this was a movie, if you were to extend it out, like that's where you'd be like, no, you'd hand him pictures. Yeah, this was me. This was my family. Like I've given that up. I've sacrificed that life. Like I'm trapped here just as much as that guy, the Howling Man. Like, we are trapped here just as much as him. But we are choosing to be trapped here to defend and to protect humanity. And that's when he says the story about, we sort of caught him and we brought World War One to an end, which is, all right, fine. Well, interesting point. But like he says, do you not realize why there's been 5 years of peace? Have you seen Russia?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Have you seen other parts of the world? They weren't peaceful from like after 1918, but okay.
This is one of the problems with this story, like, and I think a lot of supernatural stories that involve some sort of god or an effect that affects the earth is how Eurocentric they are.
Yeah.
It's easy, from the American European perspective to say, okay, here are the good periods, here are the peaceful periods. Here are periods of horror. Those don't correspond around the world. And, you pointed out about Russia. This is not true in Asia. It's not true, in Africa. I mean, it's not true in Latin America all the time, for God's sake.
There has never, ever been, even like, even like a short period of time when you can be like, the entire world is currently at peace.
Right. Yes, and the thing is, this episode knows it because it has this bit of dialogue where David says, well, what about, there's still starvation, there's still all these things, and he's told by the monk, that is the suffering that we have to, sort of God gives us, we have to endure ourselves.
Human suffering, he says.
Right.
Yeah, and I did kind of like that when there is this thing of like, well, there's human, we have to enjoy it. There's that level of human suffering that we sort of like we are responsible for. But yeah, these grand things like the Great War, that's something on another level. And I kind of like that idea because obviously, historically, like it was called the Great War. The idea was it was the war to end all wars. Like no one had seen anything like it before. Like it obliterated countryside. And so, although this is obviously 1960, like, I could fully imagine. And there were supernatural stories that were coming out of the trenches of angels and demons and stuff like that. Like people did give it a religious bent. Like the most famous one, I think, being the Angels of Mons, which isn't real. It was actually a sort of a twisting of a Machen story, Arthur Machen story, but that's different. But so this idea of the Great War had a massive impact. So again, like this idea of like the devil was the one that created this level of conflict that just people were dying. Like I can sort of see how it in a populace, especially one that's that was still very religious and spiritualism was on the rise post World War One. Like I could totally believe that there was someone that could easily believe this story.
Yeah. I mean, it does have the problem, like all of these stories, that it sort of excuses humanity.
Yes.
And of course, especially World War One is just, we sent people to fight here, just the horror and incompetence, and the system of European treaties that went off. I mean, there are man-made causes to the horrors, and I think ignoring that, not to put too fine a point on it, but I mean, it encourages another sort of Holocaust-like event when we think, well, that was an evil. On the other hand, these kinds of stories, and I say this as somebody who writes stories of Martian gods and stuff, these kinds of stories inevitably get into that. There's no way to not have that implication. And I quite like, how this sort of navigating this sort of threading the needle of, it's like Aphrodite is the goddess of love. That doesn't mean that that humans don't fall in love without Cupid hitting them or Aphrodite. It happens anyway. And that's true in Sandman too, right? I mean, destruction happens anyway. It just gets really intense when one of these gods gets involved. So I do kind of like the way they thread that needle, and it's a good story on that basis.
It is. It's one of those again where I'm like, we've said before how these are 24-minute, 25-minute episodes, and this is another one where I'm like, this could really expand. Like if you took this to 45 minutes or to an hour, like you could do so much more with this episode. Like there's so much more you could do. That could explore all kinds of things. The philosophy of, like you say, of human cruelty and humans' capability to be cruel to each other. You could have that discourse around temptation and what it is to be good and evil, and this idea of truth. Like I like the idea. There's this idea that the thing that's keeping him in there is his wooden staff. And they call it the wooden staff of truth. And actually, this idea that the truth can hold the devil at bay is a concept that isn't really explored in this. And I think it's a real shame, because it's a really neat idea that I think could have, if you were to extend this, could be really explored and, something more interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I like the staff, but it strikes me as a little silly when you flash forward and there's this tiny little staff, like, But, interestingly, in the original version of the story, it's a cross. And they didn't want to use a cross because they were scared of offending Christians. Like today we'd be like, that's honoring Christians. What are you? Yeah. But it's like, no. This is a silly story. It's the Twilight Zone. You do not use a cross in a silly story. I guess. I mean...
Okay, it's interesting to know that. I kind of like it being the staff, though, like this idea, and the fact that each of the brothers has one, like they each have a representation of it, and taken away. To be perfectly honest, taking it away from the cross actually gives it a secondary dimension. Like if it was just this representation of Jesus and that, like in Christianity, fine, but by giving it this staff of truth, gives it this whole other dimension that I think is much more interesting.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I mean, I think the cross today would come off as like, it's a sort of like, yeah, why are vampires scared of the cross? Again, it's a little sort of like, I don't know, it's too on the nose, preachy.
Yes, yeah.
But I agree with you that, the problem with an hour-long version is it's either amazing or it's worse.
Yes.
And if you cannot have that tension early on, as the mystery, what is this Howling? What are these people concealing? I agree with you. You'd be able to have those conversations. I love the ending of this as he lets the devil loose, and then he's like, I like that the monk says it's okay. Humans are often allured by the devil and don't see the devil for what he is. But then David becomes the new monk, and and it's like, this is I thought at the time, like, this is the pilot for a whole series of like, the fugitive, like, I'm chasing the devil. People don't believe he's real, but I know the difference. And one day I'll catch him. But it's amazing how much time is covered in that last like 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, yeah, because I love that idea of him tracking him down, because he commits himself to it, doesn't he? He says, like, yeah, I'll commit the rest of my life to tracking him down. And he feels responsible for like World War II and Korea War. Yeah, so he mentions all that, and I thought that was really interesting. And like you say, I love this idea. Like, there'd be a great, like say, show of him going from town to town across Europe and finding like there's been a massacre. Like one guy went crazy and killed everyone, and sort of like the devil just sort of like doing each of these little vile things. But what I thought wasn't so I do like that, and then it is kind of sort of like undercut by the little mini staff on the cupboard when you do go like, that's cute.
It's like a 1.5 foot long or something, if that, right?
It's not. It's inches long. This thing sort of like it's not. It's Barbie would have trouble herding sheep with that staff. One of the things I thought was interesting is, like I say, the story starts. We should say it's bookended, isn't it, by him talking to the camera, which again made me think of like Lovecraft or this idea of, or even again M.R. James, of this being an account of a story, like someone telling you the story. And I love that kind of thing. I often sort of get sort of like, I must tell you this tale of whenever, sort of is really good. One thing that made me chuckle though is because at the beginning it's really in your face. Like he says, like, I must tell you this tale of when I was walking, and it's really in your face. It turns out he's telling his maid. And if I was the maid, I'd be like, I'm sorry. No, I'm not. You're crazy. I'm off. Like, but she obviously then, like say, the maid, because he says, "Oh, I finally captured the devil. I have him and trapped him in there. So please ignore the howling." And that's what I wanted from the monks, was that thing of like, just ignore that. You can't go in there. And then he goes out, and he says that because he's returning. He's now captured him. He can return him to the brothers, and he wants to return him to that cell. And then you see her just lift up that little, the little sort of staff of truth. And again, like that starts it all over again.
It's a great ending. I mean,
it is a very good ending.
Tiny staff.
Yeah, which is the only sort of flaw in it.
Which is not a metaphor.
No. Yeah. No, but it is good. But it's so the moment he says, "Don't go in there," you're like, "Oh no." Like,
well, that's like like you said, the sort of Adam and Eve prohibition, right? Like, I don't know anything. I literally don't have knowledge of good and evil. Yeah. But all I know is God's like, don't eat that thing. Well, guess what people are going to do?
Yeah.
You tell your kid, you can have anything you want except for those Doritos,
Yeah. Don't think about elephants. It's that thing, isn't it? Sort of like the only thing you can't think about is elephants. Or Pandora's box, that's the idea of sort of like curiosity. Like, you can't not open the door when someone's like, "Don't look at that cupboard. Dangerous." You go, "Really?"
Whatever you do, don't think about striking out. No.
Yes.
Right.
So yeah, no, I like the ending of this, and it's fun. I do think it starts wobbly, but really finds its feet. And I said I really like the morphing of the devil as he walks across. It becomes a little bit cliched when he's sort of like got horns and a goatee and a cape, and it's almost like, okay.
I kind of like the horns though. Like the horns look like it's still the same guy. It still looks like it's his face.
Yeah.
And I kind of dig. I know what you're saying. It's over the top, but I kind of like the horn. Like the horns feel like, oh, that's that same normal face, but just, like, oh, with these invisible horns, it's like, yeah, you didn't know. There's something about it that works.
They start small and they grow in each of the things. Yeah. And then, his face changes, the beard disappears, and then he's got a goatee and his hair's neater. So they do it section by section. Like, it's not like, just a single thing. So it's done really well. I did enjoy it. But yeah, no, I thought this was a good one. Any final thoughts, though? Because it was a fun episode.
I mean, to me, this is the best episode of the season so far. I hate saying that because it's the non-Serling season and non-Serling episode. And I am bothered by the fact that I want it to be a little different than it is. Not just longer, but that, like, again, just like the Machine episode previously, it's really the ending that I love. And I have real problems with the whole thing. Having said that, I think structurally, thematically, it is the strongest episode, and it has a lot going for it.
Yes, no, it is. Yeah, I would love to see this one remade. This is one of the ones I'd love to see remade. I think there's some real sort of like, and now, if you were to do this now, this idea of having it as a flashback. And change the ending and being like, yeah, no, I had him in trapped, and he escaped in 2016.
Yeah,
and now he's paying us all back, like or whatever. Like you could do. There's a way of playing this up, and have someone who's like, I'm still tracking him down. Like I have to track him down. It's my fault that this thing, this character escaped. Yeah, I think there's room for this to be, and I just want to explore some of the concepts in this, the idea of truth and the devil and this idea. Coming from two atheists, that seems really weird, but I just like the idea of it.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And, I mean, look, if nothing else, Serling knew who, if it wasn't going to be him, he chose a good script, right, to commission and adapt. And if the worst thing, I mean, it's a pretty high bar that we feel like this could be a whole series.
Yes, yeah. This would be a pilot. Cool. This would be a backdoor pilot, as they call it now, sort of a spin-off. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed this episode, and ladies and gentlemen, I hope you did too, especially if you're watching along. But yeah, no, thank you as always for supporting us, and you can join us on the next episode.